Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Kaitlyn Theberge, the Seafood Resources Knauss Fellow at the National Sea Grant Office and a member of the Lunch and Learn Committee. Our speaker is Jeff Beauvais, who is a Knauss Legislative Fellow working in the office of Congressman Garamendi, who represents part of Contra Costa and Solano counties in the northeasternmost part of the San Francisco Bay Area. Jeff has a PhD from the University of Georgia in Integrative Conservation and Ecology, where he studied the environmental justice dimensions of marsh access, real estate development, and tourism along the South Carolina coast. Today, Jeff will share his presentation entitled Perspectives from the Hill, House of Representatives. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Kaitlyn, and hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Beauvais, and I'm happy to talk to you today about my time as a Ledge Fellow. I'll be starting with a quick overview of my path to getting here and then focus on more of my day-to-day responsibilities. I'm a Georgian. I'm from Savannah. I did my undergrad at Georgia Tech. I did my doctorate at the University of Georgia, and I applied for the Knauss through the Georgia Sea Grant program. And in keeping in the spirit of that, this beautiful photo is from St. Catherine's Island on the Georgia coast. Can I advance? Okay, there we go. It was in places like this where I got to conduct 3 summers of undergraduate research on trait-mediated indirect interactions and trophic cascades, as well as a myriad of other projects in my tenure as a technician after graduating. And I really loved this work. The questions we were pursuing were intellectually interesting, and the physical work was right up my alley. Being from the coast, I spent nearly every day of my childhood out in the marsh doing something, and this was just an extension of that. But as much as I loved the research, I kept having this nagging feeling that something was missing. I was getting to fulfill my own interests and my own curiosity, but when I would talk with friends and family, it was really clear that my work didn't have a meaningful nexus to their lives or their connection with the marshes and waterways that we collectively spent time in. And it became increasingly obvious to me that community ecology, as much as I loved it, was insufficient to understand my home in a way that was satisfying to me, or could help us prepare for the challenges that we had coming ahead. And I didn't have a word for it at the time, but what I recognize now was that I was looking for an intellectual framework to understand socio-ecological systems. And wanting to broaden those horizons, I applied to a interdisciplinary PhD program at UGA. And so during my grad school, my research took a much more sedentary turn. I traded in my mud clothes for GIS, time spent in libraries poring over old maps, and interviews with coastal residents. And I won't belabor my academic journey, but I gradually transformed from a community ecologist into a political ecologist and geographer. My graduate work largely fell in 2 buckets. The first was very quantitative, and it examined the distribution of coastal infrastructure on the South Carolina coast. That includes gray shoreline armoring infrastructure like seawalls, riprap, bulkheads, and you can see that in this map is outlined in orange. But it also included water access infrastructure that help people get into the marine environment. So think things like private docks, which you can see in the pink, public fishing piers and public boat ramps, which you can see here in green, and then marinas, one of which is in black here. And the infrastructure is interesting in and of itself. Any physical infrastructure you put into an environment, particularly a soft sediment environment like a southern salt marsh, has ecological consequences. But more critically for me, it's also a useful way to identify public and private waterfront property. And the location and distribution of waterfront property and this kind of infrastructure really helps to mediate where people can get into the marsh and use its ecosystem services that it provides. So I paired this infrastructure data set with census data in order to assess how public and private infrastructure was distributed with respect to the racial and economic composition of areas. And what we found was that particularly with docks, they were positively correlated with the percentage of an area's population that was white, even after you controlled for income, the length of the shoreline, and other features in that area. And this finding, along with several others that I, found during my research, revealed that although marshes are all public land under law, in reality, in practice, they're like heavily racially fragmented in the areas you're able to actually cross from the land into the marine environment. And I argued that it constituted an environmental justice issue in South Carolina. And so we had this finding, and that data was from recent times, but I became interested in how far back we could look. So I spent a lot of time in libraries finding these old aerial photo mosaics like you see here, and I was able to go back to the 1950s and create a roughly decadal time series of infrastructure development on the coast. Sorry about that, I hit my mouse wheel. And this is what that looks like on a part of Hilton Head Island in South Carolina. And you can see in these photos the growth of this little spit off of the island from an area with no development in 1959 to just 13 years later, you have 32 houses, all with a dock associated with them. You can also see on the backside of this little piece of land, they cut a channel to permanently allow deep water access for those structures. And then if you fast forward, another 40-ish years, you get another doubling of the amount of infrastructure on that island. And this tiny little area of land now has 64 docks crowding it. And so zooming out to the whole state coastline, here on the left, you can see a GIF of dock development in each decade, and each point is the location of a single dock. And docks truly grew exponentially during this time period. In the 1960s, there were only 945 along the whole South Carolina coast, and by 2015, there were over 12,000 of them. And the figure on the right is just a marginal effects plot from a generalized linear model using that census data. And I've removed the error bars so you can see the trends a bit more clearly. But you can see in every decade from 1990 to the present, the abundance of docks is positively correlated with the percentage of an area that is white. And so I had all this quantitative data showing a pervasive and persistent environmental justice issue around marsh access. But of course, observational studies can only provide modest insights into the mechanisms that produce those patterns. So drawing on a lot of great historical work in the Southeast, I argued, as many others have, not just me, that the growth of the tourism and real estate market along the coast has driven substantial Black and Gullah Geechee land loss in the area. And that fueled coastal infrastructure development and racially fragmented access to the marsh and all the ecosystem services it provides. And to dig into these mechanistic aspects a little more, I developed my more qualitative social science methodology to investigate how the tourism industry, the structure of local government in Beaufort County, South Carolina, and the politics of knowledge both produced and were a product of environmental injustices. And I did this by focusing on a specific case study of a company attempting to build an ecotourism resort on this island in Beaufort County. And so I spent a lot of time reading mind-numbing zoning, tourism, construction ordinances. I interviewed supporters and opponents of the resort, and I attended community meetings like this interminable 3.5-hour meeting of the county's Zoning Board of Appeals in order to address these questions that I had. And for the social scientists in the webinar over here, you can get a little glimpse of the narrative analysis coding that I did. And spending all this time studying Beaufort County's government, as well as my own personal interest in politics, primed me to want to work on the legislative side of the Knauss. And what I found in my research, and what numerous others have argued as well, is that local governments are not structured or conducive to robust democratic participation. And that's a problem that plays a big role in producing a lot of local environmental injustices. And so, part of the issue I was identifying also was that local government's just one piece of the pie here in the US. And it's surprisingly difficult to find a decent graphic about federalism. So I'm using this pleasantly good one from Kids Discover. So it's good, we're getting some good civics lessons to our youth today. But I was interested in land use decisions, and land use is fundamentally and primarily a local government issue. And if we were to overlay this further with, a graphic showing the distribution of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial, I was realizing by the end of my dissertation that I really only had exposure to local executive government. You know, I had some state and local legislative and judicial issues sprinkled in, but I was really narrowly focused on local executive government. And you know, I had very little experience with federal law or federal policy and decision making, and that really drove my desire to, one, join the Knauss, and then to focus on the legislative side so that I could understand what the political process was like at the federal level. So I was fortunate to be placed in the office of Congressman John Garamendi, who represents California's 8th Congressional District. He sits on the Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which I'll refer to as T&I. And as my legislative director likes to joke, California office handling the plane, train, and automobile portfolio is just a natural fit for a Georgian who studies salt marshes. But there is some overlap, which I'll discuss shortly. Beyond taking on a portfolio that was very outside of my wheelhouse and having to quickly learn those issues, another major feature of my fellowship has been that the congressman's district has drastically changed from last session of Congress to this one. So you can see we functionally have an entirely new district. The only piece that's preserved from last Congress is the southernmost piece of our old district is now the northernmost piece of our new district. And you know, the demographics of the district are obviously very different, as you can see from the census data here. And the character is also very different as well. The old district was sparsely populated, very rural, and primarily agricultural, whereas this new district is, you know, an urban area that's heavily industrialized. So it's been a major change for the office, and it's presented a lot of opportunities and challenges with that. So here's a better view of the current district. The western edge of our district is over here in Richmond, California. The northern end is Fairfield and part of Vacaville, and the district's eastern end is at Antioch. And we have a tiny bit of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta in our district. It ends right above Pittsburgh here around Browns Island before the delta feeds out into Sassoon Bay, then into the San Pablo Bay and the greater San Francisco Bay further down here in the south. And because of our location and the congressman's prior district, which was more up here and encompassed more of the Delta proper, we do continue some work related to the Delta, such as supporting funding requests for the installation of fish screens and some wetland restoration projects. So there's a bit of overlap with my former life, but that said, because this is a new district, our office is adjusting to it and learning the issues it faces. So, a good example is flooding. The old district faced a lot of riverine flooding issues, whereas this new district, because it's more coastal, certainly more coastal than the old district, we're dealing with sea level rise issues, and because it's more urban, we're dealing with some stormwater management flooding issues as well. And so the approaches that you take to those obviously have to change and transition. Another good example is that our district contains all 5 of Northern California's extant oil refineries, which I've marked with white stars on the map. And with that brings a lot of opportunity to think about a just transition away from fossil fuels. And our office is starting to spend a major amount of time strategizing about the role we can play in keeping these refineries open, because they're major employers in the region, but also getting them to begin to produce more sustainable fuels that provide or produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, as an environmental justice scholar, I see refinery and I have like red lights flashing in my mind because they're heavy polluters. And one of the counties in our district has 25% higher asthma-related hospitalizations than the US average. So, again, from my perspective as an EJ scholar, What I'm trying to focus on in the last few months of my fellowship is what we can do legislatively to work with the communities that live around these refineries to alleviate air quality issues they deal with, because it's not just the refineries they're surrounded by. There's major highways in the district that have heavy truck traffic because it's an industrial area. You have all the other industrial industry in the area. You have several major rail lines. You have several gas-powered power plants, and you have the Port of Richmond as well. So this is really a confluence of some really challenging air quality issues, which just has environmental justice issues written all over them. So now that you have a better sense of the area that we represent, I want to give a breakdown of what my time in the office is like. I break my work into 4 major categories. The first is floor work, which primarily consists of keeping track of bills and amendments that will be voted on that day and making recommendations to the congressman on how to vote. We also occasionally draft amendments to bills that are scheduled to make it to the floor, and we prepare remarks for the congressman if he wants to speak on the floor about a bill. To be frank, this really only takes about 5% of my time in a normal week. And that's because in this current Congress, so many votes are party line that there's really not much to recommend. There's only been a handful of times in my 6 months on staff where, a floor vote that I was responsible for providing a recommendation for required us on staff to think deeply and deliberate on it. A good example of that is a few months ago, there was a Congressional Review Act disapproving of the Biden administration's rule regarding some tariff issues around solar panel components. And because of some longstanding priorities of my boss, we voted against party line on that issue. And I'll talk about sort of how you think through those kinds of things momentarily. Also, I've never had to prepare floor remarks for the boss. He really doesn't talk on the floor very often. This is not a universal thing. Some members talk on the floor, it seems like almost every day. And to be honest, talking on the floor it's really performative. It mainly exists so that your press team can get like good clips and sound bites for social media, because members of Congress are not going to floor debate, at least on the House side. They're not going to floor debate to like listen and change their minds on things. It really is more of a performative process. And there are things like commendations, recognitions of people in the district that are important and genuine, but floor debate is actually not genuine debate. And I meant to say at the start, and I'd like to say, I think every legislative fellow's experience is very different. And so these are really just the perspectives from my office. And the second major category of work that we do is more constituent-facing work. And on my end, this means writing letters almost every day. So these are letters of support for grant applications from local organizations in our area, or sending requests to agencies. And letter writing is a major part of the job because we can achieve a lot of things that are priorities for our office through non-legislative means like letter writing. Whether that's getting a community organization that's doing great work money to continue work through a grant, or whether it's writing an agency a formal letter, asking them to interpret their authorities a bit more broadly or in a specific way, or maybe pushing a project along that's delayed. Letter writing is very useful, and it's something that we do quite a bit of. I also coordinate with our press staff to provide them with information that they need for any press releases, social media, or newsletters they put out. So this is just an example on the right here of a press release I helped work with our press staff on regarding the FAA, the recent FAA reauthorization, and highlighting the things we were able to achieve as an office in it, as well as, because we are in the Democratic Party, sort of celebrating the Democratic wins in that bill. The next major category of work is committee work, and this is probably the biggest part of my portfolio. When I started out, I was just assisting with it, but now that I'm about 6 months in and comfortable, I basically handle all of the T&I committee work, unless it's something that's particularly contentious and we need to think hard on. Then I'll coordinate with other staff on it. So I write questions for the congressman to ask witnesses during hearings. And given that we sit on 4 subcommittees on T&I and we often wave onto other subcommittees if the boss is interested, this is a sizable part of my weekly work. I also prepare recommendations for votes on bills and amendments during committee markups. And for those who are unfamiliar, markups are just meetings of the committee, the whole committee, in which they consider, amend, and vote on bills before they get to the whole House for a vote. And this is a much more involved process than floor vote recommendations are. T&I in particular prides itself on being very bipartisan, particularly among the leadership. Relative to a committee like House Natural Resources, there's a lot fewer bomb throwers on this committee. There are certainly some pretty prickly and contentious members, but overall the committee prides itself on being bipartisan, and because of that, they work really hard to compromise and find middle ground on priorities. And so these votes are much less party line, and they often require a lot of deliberation and thinking to provide a good recommendation for. And the last part of this job is working with committee staff on getting our office priorities for major reauthorization bills into the bill text. So things like the FAA reauthorization that passed last month, or the upcoming reauthorization for the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I'm less involved with this process because it's a real slow burn. A lot of these reauthorizations both predate my time in the office and they'll post-date my tenure in the office. And so our legislative director handles the bulk of this, though I do provide, research assistance and things like that. And then the final part, which I won't spend too much time on because Zoe's going to focus on the actual drafting of legislation, is the legislative work. And I think that's what most people think of when they think of Congress. This is doing background research into legislation and working with Leg Counsel to write the actual language of bills. We also reach out to committee staff, federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofits for technical assistance on bills. We also reach out to nonprofits to gain endorsements for bills or other members of the House to co-sponsor our bills. And I also provide recommendations to the congressman on whether we should co-sponsor bills from other members. I do all 4 of these tasks every week, but the work really, the percentage breakdown really changes depending on whether we're in session or not. And so things like doing the long-term research to draft legislation, I just don't have time to work on if we're in a busy session week. And so some of the challenges, and I think I'm a little low on time, so I'm going to speed through these, is mainly that we work in extremely tight timelines, particularly for constituent-facing and committee work. A good example is particularly in committee work during markups, even though, or hearings, we might know that it's coming a week or 2 in advance, but we don't get like the witness list and the witness testimony for a hearing until 2 days before the bill, or 2 days before the hearing. And for markups, we usually don't get the bill text and amendment list until 2 days prior to the markup. And for simple bills and simple markups, that's fine. But like the FAA reauthorization was 800 pages long. So unless you're extremely well prepared, you just don't have time to provide amendments in that span of time you're given. And this is frankly, it's a control tactic that committee leadership uses to try to prevent their hard bipartisan work from becoming muddied, because if you give people not enough time to file amendments, they're not going to file as many amendments. The last thing I will say is that the congressman's been in office for longer than I have been alive. So learning the priorities and positions of a person who's been in government for decades is a lot of work, and it really shapes the way I think about and approach issues. So like he's really big on maritime trade issues, and so I will focus, like if I want to talk about environmental justice, I might spin that through the lens of electrifying ports to reduce NOx emissions or other emissions from port areas to help those communities. The opportunities and successes are a bit more self-explanatory, so I'm happy to answer questions of them, but I want to respect Zoe's time, so I will wrap it up and answer any questions that you have.